like to thank the organizers for inviting me today. I will be talking to you today about poetic naturalism versus non-physical reality. Now, the motivation for this talk came out of two things. Partly, some things I read in The Big Picture by Sean Carroll and proposals he made around poetic naturalism. And I'll talk a little bit about that first, but it also came out of my own work looking into the idea behind miracles and free will and how that connects with our current understanding of science. Now, in The Big Picture, Sean Carroll proposes an idea, poetic naturalism, that combines two different things. The poetic part is really the idea that when we look at the world around us, there's different length scales, and we would describe the world at these different levels in a very real sense. So when you talk about people, it makes sense to have a science of people and how they behave. Maybe that's psychology. When you talk about molecules, you can treat them a certain way, all the way down to the smallest fundamental length scale, which is particles and fields and forces and quantum fields and quarks. Now, the sense in which this is real is an interesting concept that we'll explore in the talk. Underlying it all is the idea of naturalism, which is really a physicalism, and it's the idea that all levels of reality depend on this, what he called core theory of quantum fields, which is basically just particles and forces. Now, the poetic level, as I make a note here, is a type of emergence, which is an idea I'm going to go into in a little more depth later in the talk. But the idea that the different length scales have an emergent phenomena that has to be described in their own right. Now, what I'd like to do, my title was a versus, poetic naturalism versus a non-physical reality. So I'd like to consider a counter-proposal. And to do that, I want to look at some of the ideas, two big ideas that he hits in his book. And the first is, one of the key challenges he makes to a postulate that God exists is the statement, how can you explain a non-physical entity, thing, reality interacting with the physical? Now, this is an interesting question. Some of the other talks have looked at what it means to have a non-physical reality, but this takes it to the next level and asks how the two interact. The other idea he brings up is free will. Now, free will is an interesting one because most of us feel like it's real. We feel like we have choices in life, and our gut instinct strongly supports the idea of free will. And so it's often a challenge, though, to figure out where free will would come from in a world governed by the laws of physics, which are highly algorithmic, and even when you have probability, we will show don't really admit for free will. What Sean Carroll does is he tries to use poetic naturalism as the way into this, the idea that, well, once you're at the level of people, free will actually is real in a sense because it's at that level, but it's explainable ultimately by the core theory. And I think this is the weak point in the connection that he's making that I want to come back to. But let's first look a little bit at this challenge of how things non-physical interact with the physical. I would claim in this space, we're actually dealing with something that intellectually is no different than postulating a new physical interaction, only now it's an interaction between the non-physical and the physical. So we'll look at that in some more detail in the talk. When it comes to free will, I think this is the most interesting question because I will argue that free will can only exist if there really is a non-physical reality, still leaving open the question, how would that interact with physical reality? Now, in all of these cases, what we're really talking about is the challenge of what assumptions are we going to make. Now, in poetic naturalism, there is a key underlying assumption, one that God does not exist, miracles cannot happen, and at the core, nothing violates this core theory of how forces and particles are defined in quantum field theory. Now, an alternate assumption, which will underlie some of the ideas in my talk, is the idea that reality is broader than just physical reality. But one requirement of this is that the broader reality is consistent with the laws of physics, and that these do not unduly limit the concept of God, but they actually do rule out certain concepts of God, and we will see that as we go through. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about four main things. I'm going to look at emergence, which is basically the idea of when are higher levels new laws, this idea of the poetic part of poetic naturalism. I want to talk a little bit about non-physical reality. What does it really mean to have non-physical reality? And address this idea of how could it interact with physical reality. And I'd like to look at free will as the central question. That'll be the turning point in the talk. And I'll close with miracles, which I think are an interesting question. Now, all four of these on their own could be their own talk. And so when we look at this, we want to be really clear and understand that I'm doing a very, very brief overview. And if you want to, there's a lot more here that can be said about each of these topics. So let's start with emergence. There are really two aspects of emergence I want to look at. This is the real, primarily science moment in the talk, and that is laws of a new type and measurement scale. So what do I mean by laws of a new type? In this case, I think entropy is our best example. So entropy in the second law of thermodynamics and statistical physics in general deals with systems with very many degrees of freedom, many particles. And it's really nice here. I usually don't like to put very long quotes up in my talks, but it's nice to quote Landau-Lifshitz here, who says, thus, although the motion of systems with a very large number of degrees of freedom obeys the same laws of mechanics of that of systems consisting of a small number of particles, the existence of many degrees of freedom results in laws of a different kind. And you can see I highlight that last bit in purple. This is the key point that Landau and Lifshitz are making at this point. Individual particles still have to obey, whether it's quantum mechanics or classical mechanics, whatever the appropriate description is for particle-particle interactions. However, entropy really doesn't derive from the fundamental laws, and it's really of a completely different nature. It's not about individual particle interactions. It is its own law in its own right. It doesn't really refer back to any core theory, any fundamental quantum field theory of particles and forces. And this concept of a law of a new type is critical to keep in mind as we think about the physical interacting with the non-physical. Now, the second issue is the measurement problem. And what I really mean by the measurement problem, it's not really a problem, I just use that word, is the idea that when we look at different length scales, we are going to get different physics. Now, this is the most closely related to the idea Sean Carroll raised about the poetic part of poetic naturalism, looking at different length scales. But there's a fundamental character here that I think that is important to recognize. So back here we have the picture of foams. And when you look at foams, you realize, particularly aqueous foams, the molecular level, all the molecules are in a fluid state. They're either gas or liquid. They're free to move. If you did experiments on the individual molecules, you would conclude the system is a liquid or a fluid. When you look at the scale of the entire foam, however, depending on the measurement you do in the state of the system, it either acts like a solid, holds its shape, or it flows like a fluid. We know intuitively this happens because the bubbles get in each other's way. It has nothing to do with the individual molecular dynamics. It has to do with structure on a mesoscopic scale. The interesting physics or scientific question is, what scale do you need to reach to measure to understand the behavior of the whole system? We know the molecular scale fails, where we know if you look at the entire system, you get the right answer. But is there a scale in between? If you know enough about the bubbles, say you measure 15, 20 bubbles and their behavior inside the foam, will you be able to determine what's going on in the entire foam? And this is an interesting question from a scientific point of view, because it says, for a very, very large system with a lot of degrees of freedom, say all of physical reality, do you need to measure the whole system to understand all its properties, or can you measure a piece of it? And if you're measuring a piece of it, how large does it have to be? So keep these two ideas from emergence in the back of your mind. The next step I want to look at is physical reality and its interactions with the non-physical. Now, the first challenge is to define physical reality. And when I poll the audience in the talk, there's a lot of different ways we can get at it. When I give talks to general audiences, I usually focus on the idea of it's the part of reality we explore through our five senses and the instruments we build to enhance our senses. That's the physical intuition for physical reality. One can also think about it as the reality that's reducible to fundamental particles and waves and described in that fashion. That would be, I think, more along the lines of what Sean Carroll proposes in his book with the core theory idea. There's also this very kind of big idea that you might think about, which is it's that part of reality that is governable and regular by what we might call laws of nature. Now, this is a more general definition and open to large expansion because what we mean by laws can actually change. But usually, in its common use, it's used to describe laws that we already know that have the similar character to the physical laws we have if we haven't discovered them yet. Now, non-physical reality has a lot of candidates, and it's already been talked about at this meeting, and it is in many of the talks and the focus of a lot of the talks here. One of the big ones I think everyone's familiar with is mathematics. Mathematics, as far as we can tell, are real, but they're not physical. We certainly don't understand them through our five senses. I would argue that the wave function in quantum mechanics is an example of something that's real. It's everything we can see about experiments shows that the wave function is not just a math trick. It actually describes a part of reality. It really gives the state of the system. And yet, you can't really call it physical because you never measure it directly with your senses or the tools you use to expand your senses. You're always measuring the modulus squared of the wave function. Now, if we use our broadest definition as things that obey laws of nature, you might argue the wave function is physical because it does fit into that category. A new one that I don't often list, but was subject of one of the earlier talks in this meeting, is of course conscious experience. And conscious experience, particularly in the realm of philosophy, there's very strong, solid arguments that that might be a great example of a non-physical reality, and you can make good arguments, and you should see the other talks in this meeting to see some of those arguments. Now, all of these raise the question of what does it mean to interact with the physical? And Sean Carroll raises this as one of the largest stumbling blocks for the existence of something non-physical, the idea that you can't even imagine the interaction. Well, what I'd like to do is propose how we would imagine it, first at the crudest level, where we look at the spherical picture of reality and all of reality. So imagine the yellow is the fullness of reality, that is God. The blue is physical reality. There is a boundary or a place that they meet, and they can interact with each other. But what does that interaction really look like? And how does this occur? These are interesting questions. They're very similar. You could phrase it as what does the interaction look like, or what is the nature of the interactions? And what I'm trying to get at here is you're really asking a question of, does it look like the mathematical formulations we now have for the interactions between particles through forces, or does it look completely different? That's one question to ask. But I would like to propose at least the simplest first counter to Sean Carroll's proposal that you can't even imagine it, with an analogy to what we do see in physical reality with particles. So keep in mind that this is just an analogy. But on the one hand, you have electrons and protons. These are charged particles. They interact with each other through the electromagnetic force. We know the electron and the proton actually attract each other because opposite charges attract, like charges repel. Now ask yourself what happens with a neutron. The first thing you notice is that the neutron doesn't interact at all with the electron. It's neutral. It shouldn't interact with the proton if all you know is electricity and magnetism. But when you realize that the strong force exists, you get that interaction between the neutron and the proton. And again, this is an analogy, but it's an analogy to point a direction in how to think about things. Already in physical reality, we have a situation where some things interact generically through every possible interaction, and some things are very specific. So the proton is a generic thing that can interact both through electricity and magnetism with the electron and through the strong force with the neutron. Another way, if we carry our analogy forward, we have physical things that only interact through physical laws. We have non-physical things that interact with each other in the non-physical realm. And we have these special objects that can interact both with the physical and the non-physical. And that is a way you can imagine the non-physical interacting with the physical. Again, it's only an analogy, but it sets the stage as a way to start thinking about how these processes work. Now, there is an emotional issue underlying this that I do want to highlight. On the one hand, we have this deep understanding that the natural and physical reality equate with laws of nature, that there's regular laws that they're following. On the other hand, there's often this intuition or emotional issue that God or supernatural is equated with arbitrary powers, perhaps that break these laws of nature, or acts of will. And we often ask ourselves, as we as humans experience a world where we do believe we have choice, where is this space of physical and non-physical? How do the laws of nature really limit us? Do they also limit God? And where are these acts of will? And so this is the transition really to this next question that I don't get to cover in this talk, but if there are laws for the non-physical, if there are interactions between the non-physical and the physical, does this limit God at all? And if so, in what way? So let's transition to the central point, point 3, which is free will. And this will tie back in a little bit to emergence and ask the question, is there really a new law here? What is true choice is the other way of phrasing this question. And can free will arise from what I'm going to call an algorithmic system? Now, many of the talks in this meeting, we looked at quantum mechanics and its role in being probabilistic and the wave function collapsing and the fundamental nature of quantum mechanics. But at the end, even when you're in quantum mechanics, all decisions are at least algorithmic, if not deterministic. And what do I mean by that? You would have a bunch of inputs into something, in this case, the brain. Chemistry and physics would happen, quantum mechanics would govern it, and you would either get outcome A or outcome B. Now, it might be determined by a probabilistic event, the collapse of the wave function. It might be purely deterministic with no probability involved at all. But either way, the decision that's being made is following some set of rules. At its heart, it doesn't have that intuitive feel of what real true choice is. It does point to a key part of us as humans. Most of our decisions, I would argue, many of the things we do every day actually come from instinct and intuition and are probably purely reactions of the chemistry and physics in our brain to the inputs. It's the only way we can survive is in a world of intuition, reflex, and reaction. But there are those moments where we feel like we're actually contemplating the situation and making a true choice. And where do those come from? I would argue they can't emerge like an emergent phenomena. They have to be, kind of like entropy is, a truly new type of law, a truly new type of behavior. So it really brings us to this idea that if free will isn't coming from what we understand as the existing laws of physics, what must be it a part of? Well, it certainly has to be consistent with the laws of physics, and this is where the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics and entropy in the second law of thermodynamics come in. They create a very nice space for free will to act in, but they don't explain or justify free will. So I would argue that it's not caused by probability, but there's a singular nature of free will. These isolated moments of choice, and experiments are about reproducible actions and behavior. So it really raises interesting questions of how you would even design an experiment around free will and to test for it and distinguish free will from just the natural probability-based decisions that occur in quantum mechanics. So if we assume that reality free will really gives us a non-physical element, what might be the next steps? What else might emerge from this? And I would argue the final kind of piece to this talk is that there is a strong connection between free will and how we want to think about miracles. And it really is this idea of the freedom to change coupled with the power of grace. So when we look at miracles, we really think about miracles as something that actually doesn't get discussed a lot. I call it the elephant in the room. And when I gave the talk, I asked the audience to define miracles. And it was interesting, the general consensus that came out about miracles as being focused on violations of physical law, rare events, action of God in the world, intervention of God. But that underlying theme of violating physical laws as well as being very, very rare events came out a lot. And I would argue we actually want to turn our definition of miracle around and think about it slightly differently. And we go back to that space. The core thing I think we all agree on is that there's a sense in which miracles are the interaction between non-physical reality or God and physical reality. So you can even talk about miracles initially without even referring to God if you believe and understand that free will exists and there's this non-physical reality out there that has to interact with reality. So at this point, I started the first section, Emergence, as the straightforward science section of the talk. As we now merge into the section on miracles, I do want to transition a little bit and focus on changing this definition of miracles, but do it grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition by looking at the Bible. And if you ask about miracles in the Bible, you realize a few things. They come freely from God, which is a unique new perspective on miracles. They bring people closer to God. They generally involve a shocking of people into a new view of themselves or their community. And underlying that, they're not actually about the act of violating physical law. When you think about what was happening, we forget that humans, for most of our history, shared fundamental truths by telling stories. And if you experienced something incredibly shocking that transformed you, the story you would tell to try and convey that meaning would most likely contain elements that look like violations of physical law where those aren't the main point of the story. And this is a real challenge for us. As a scientifically based society, we read the miracles, whether it's Noah's Ark, water turning into wine, Moses parting the Red Sea, And we're drawn to trying to explain it on scientific grounds. We focus on the apparent violation of physical law more than we focus on the transformation that people experience. And if we're going to take it seriously, even if you look at Jesus' discussion of miracles in the Gospels, he says around one of his miracles where they bring a paralytic to him, and he goes to the paralytic, "Your sins are forgiven," and everyone's shocked, "Oh, how can he forgive sins?" He points out that it's easy to heal people, it's hard to forgive sins, and the reason he heals them, and this is the quote in purple, is that you may know that the Son of Man has the power on earth to forgive sins. I'm going to perform this actual physical miracle. And so the point of it is never the physical miracle. It's never the apparent violation of physical law. And it's really about transforming people, in this case, the forgiveness of sins. So when we look at the miracles, we actually have to think about it from an interesting perspective. If you take the miracles of Jesus, they fall into four main categories: feeding people, healing people, being in harmony with nature, and what I would call extreme nonviolence. And again, if you turn to the words Jesus gives us, he claims that we will not only do these, but we will do even greater works than him. And the miracles are not about sitting around waiting for a magic act from God that violates physical laws. The miracle is about exercising our free will to choose to actually perform these miracles. And so the question and challenge for us is, are we ready for this? Are we ready to end hunger? Are we ready to provide universal health care? Are we ready to see the natural world as something to work with and not control or exploit? And perhaps the greatest challenge, are we ready to end war? Now, these are immense challenges. I find them very challenging, but many of these are mathematically and technologically possible. Where does the will come from to do this? And this is where I tie in the two. Ultimately, it comes back to free will. We have to choose to act on the gift of the grace of God, which is our ability to interact with the non-physical, to achieve these greater works that were promised to us. So if we come full circle, I started with talking about poetic naturalism. And what I really want to highlight from that is, first, it recognizes that there are these different scales. We talked about emergence, and that we need descriptions on those different scales. Now, one thing poetic naturalism did is it tried very hard to keep things in a purely physical description by focusing on a core reductionism. The fundamental scale that drives things is the core theory of quantum field theory. And everything has to be consistent with them. And here, Sean Carroll and I would agree with, there needs to be consistency in the way Landau and Lifshitz talked about. But it is not the only thing. You actually get laws of a new and different kind. And I think this is where free will really points us to that breakdown of a purely physical description and the requirement of something non-physical. It also, emergence, when we think about it seriously, raises an interesting question as what happens when we scale up from the human scale. And that's really the measurement problem that I brought forth in the foam discussion, is if you're trying to understand the fullness of reality, or the fullness of physical reality even, at what scale do you need to measure to capture all the laws of physics that would exist, just like at what scale in the foam do you need to measure to capture the behavior of the foam. So in summary, I think there is a challenge of language in physical versus non-physical. As you saw, it's a little hard to figure out what the right definition is. And as we move into the non-physical, I imagine that we would still discover, quote, laws of nature, just laws of a very different kind. I think an interesting place to focus our study and thought is in the area of free will, because these singular acts of choice will always have to be and look consistent with the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics and the second law of thermodynamics with entropy, but by their very definition of singular acts of choice, really are not subject to experimentational test in the traditional sense. So we have to think of a new way to explore this problem. And there's the idea of how do we fundamentally understand experiments in a space that is defined by all of reality and includes these one-time events. So, as I said, I'd like to propose we redefine language somewhat and focus on all of reality, and then just be careful about our assumptions and how we explore that hypothesis. And as we move forward, really consider and look into this idea of free will as being a law of a fundamentally different character. Now, just as a close, I have to put in a brief self-advertisement for my book, Divine Science, Finding Reason at the Heart of Faith. It is available on Amazon, but it's also available online in lots of different places. It's published by Franciscan Media. If you like some of the ideas I said, again, this was a very quick overview. Most of these ideas are actually in the book and came from the book. Some of them I've developed a little bit further, particularly in response to ideas I've read in The Big Picture from Sean Carroll and in other places and references. So there is a chapter on free will and miracles that covers the core ideas I talked about here. I take them a little bit farther in this talk. So this is the portion of the talk where we'd normally be doing questions and answers, and I thought since that wasn't actually recorded, I would answer one of the main questions I regularly get after giving this talk. In the course of this talk, there are two things I focus on. One is providing this analogy to how the non-physical might interact with the physical through the strong force and electromagnetism. And the other is a real emphasis on miracles not being violations of physical law. And that focus during the talk is appropriate, but it tends to lead to the question, well, are either of these, or is there any sense in which I'm limiting what God can and can't do? And what I'd like to clarify is the purpose of the talk and the way I speak about this is not to necessarily describe what might limit God. By definition, most definitions of God include an idea of being unlimited or the maximum of reality or the fullness of reality. However, it's important, I think, always to think about how we think about God theologically and what God may or may not choose to do. And so my point in the miracle section is that there isn't a need for miracles to violate physical law to accomplish the main purpose, which is transforming people and transforming the world. So it's important to have that distinguish between what God can and can't do and what God might choose to do. So that's one thing I like to clarify. And then with the analogy to laws of nature and laws around interactions with the physical and the non-physical, this is really in response and meant to be an answer to the question Sean Carroll posed in his book, can you even imagine a way that these things might interact? And so it's really just a first step in that process of imagining how these interactions might be. And again, I go back to the idea of entropy being a law of a completely different kind than the fundamental laws of two-particle interactions. As one continues to explore this space, whether from a point of view of philosophy or if it ever becomes possible to do it from a point of view of traditional science involving experiments and measurement, we would see what the character of those laws are as they emerge. So I really want to be clear, the focus on the talk is to establish some of these parameters of what might be possible, not necessarily to claim any limits on God per se. And again, that's one of the most common questions I get, so I thought I'd answer it here, even though there isn't a space to ask questions. Thank you.